So let me set the scene for you. It's 1912, Ellis Island. A young man steps off a steamship from Naples, Italy. His name is recorded by the immigration inspector as Salvatore Maranzano, 22 years old. Occupation, laborer. Destination, his uncle's address on Mulberry Street in Manhattan. Picture that for a moment. He's crossing the Great Hall at Ellis Island, probably exhausted after weeks at sea and steerage class. He doesn't speak English. He's carrying everything he owns in a bag. And somewhere in that building, a clerk is writing down his name in an official record, a name that will follow him into a new country and a new life. Now, that same young man shows up in the 1920 U.S. Census, living in Brooklyn, working as a barber. His name on the census? Samuel Martin. Same person, different name, different bureau, different occupation. And here's what makes this mystery worth chasing. Between those two records, there's almost nothing. No naturalization papers filed under either name. No marriage record. No World War I draft registration. No city directory listing. No death record. He is, for all practical purposes, a ghost for 8 years. A man who arrived at Ellis Island and then somehow became an entirely different person. That is the story of my listener's great-grandfather. She reached out to me a few weeks ago, said she'd been sitting on this brick wall for 3 years. 3 years of searching for Salvatore Maranzano, finding nothing after 1912. Then, one day, almost by accident, she found Samuel Martin in the 1920 census, recognized her great-grandmother's name listed as his wife, and realized she'd been looking for the wrong man the entire time. She had found him, but now she had a completely different problem. She didn't know who he actually was. She didn't know when the name changed or how or why. She didn't know if there were Italian records she'd missed. She didn't know if there was a legal paper trail or if the change had just happened quietly, the way so many things happened quietly for Italian immigrants in that era. She had a face and a census record, but she didn't have a story. And I want to be really clear about something before we go any further. This happens all the time with Italian genealogy research, and it trips up researchers constantly. Italian immigrants change their names for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it was pressure to assimilate. Sometimes an employer or a neighbor just started using an Americanized version and it stuck. Sometimes it was a deliberate legal act, a formal court petition documented in paper. And sometimes, honestly, it was a survival strategy. The early 1900s in New York were complicated for Italian immigrants in ways that the history books don't always capture. There was significant anti-Italian prejudice in this era. Being legible, being pronounceable, being seen as American was not just a social preference. For many people, it was a practical necessity for finding work and housing. The common myth is that immigration officials at Ellis Island changed Italian names without the immigrants' knowledge or consent. Researchers who have studied this closely have found that is largely not true. The manifests were created in Italy by Italian officials before the ships departed. So whatever name was on the manifest when that ship left Naples was almost certainly accurate. What happened to names after arrival? In American workplaces and courthouses and census records is a different story entirely. And that is the story we are chasing today. So this week, I want to walk you through exactly how I helped her approach this problem using 3 AI tools: Claude, Gemini through Google AI Studio, and Perplexity. Each one doing something specific. Each one filling in a piece of the puzzle. And I want to show you the exact prompts I use because I want you to be able to do this for your own research the moment this episode is over. This is the kind of mystery that AI is genuinely built for. Not to solve it for us, but to help us think through it more clearly and find records we might have never found on our own. Because remember the rule around here, AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. Welcome to Ancestors and Algorithms, the podcast where family history meets artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Brian, and I'm so glad you're here for episode 28. Today, we're diving into one of the most common and most frustrating brick walls in Italian genealogy research, the ancestor who arrived in America under one name and became a completely different person in the records. We're going to follow that listener's case from start to finish, and I'm going to show you exactly how I use three AI tools, Claude, Gemini through Google AI Studio, and Perplexity, to build a research strategy, crack open a handwritten document I couldn't read on my own, and ultimately connect an Italian immigrant in Brooklyn to a birth record in a small town outside Naples. By the end of this episode, you'll have 5 copy-paste ready prompts you can use on your own Italian research, or honestly, on any immigrant ancestor whose name shifted between the old country and the new one. All right, let's go find out who Samuel Martin really was. Before I touched a single AI tool, I did what every genealogist should do. I gathered everything that was already known and wrote it down in a single place I call Research Dossier. Here's what we had. The 1912 ship manifest listing Salvatore Maranzano, born approximately 1890 in Naples Province, arriving on the SS Duca di Genova. The 1920 federal census listing Samuel Martin, age 29, born Italy, residing at an address in Brooklyn, occupation barber, wife Conchetta, daughter Rosa, age 2. And a family photograph taken sometime in the 1930s with names written on the back in a relative's handwriting. One of those names, Grandfather Sam. That's it. That's the whole file. 3 pieces of evidence and an 8-year gap that swallows the man whole. Now, most researchers at this point would start searching for all the obvious things. Draft registration, city directories, naturalization records, and that's absolutely what needed to happen. But before you can search effectively, you need to know what you're looking for and where it might actually be. And this is where the first AI tool came in. I opened Perplexity, which is a research tool that searches the web and gives you cited, verified answers rather than just a list of links to sort through. And the reason I went to Perplexity first was because I needed historical context. I needed to understand the landscape that Salvatore Maranzano was walking into when he arrived in New York in 1912, because that context would tell me a lot about why and how a name change might have happened. Here's the exact prompt I use, and I want you to write this down or bookmark it because this works for any immigrant ancestor you're researching. Quote, I'm researching an Italian immigrant from Naples, Campania, who arrived in New York City in 1912. He appears in U.S. records under a completely Americanized name beginning around 1920. I need to understand first what were the most common reasons Italian immigrants from southern Italy changed their names during the 1910 to 1920 period. Second, what types of records would document a legal name change in New York during this era and where are those records held today? Third, what did the naturalization process look like for Italian immigrants between 1912 and 1920, and what records would it have generated? Please include sources for all your answers, end quote. Now, the reason I structured it that way, 3 specific questions with a request for sources, is that Perplexity works best when you give it a focused research task rather than a vague question. If you just ask, how do I research Italian name changes, you'll get a general overview. But if you give it a specific scenario and specific questions, you get targeted information that you can actually use. What Perplexity came back with changed how I thought about this case entirely. It confirmed what researchers know but sometimes forget. Italian names were not systematically changed at Ellis Island. That is a myth. The immigration inspector was working from a manifest that was created in Italy by Italian officials, so the name on the manifest was almost certainly how it was spelled back home. What happened more often was that once Italian immigrants were in the United States, their names were anglicized gradually through a combination of employer pressure, school enrollment records for children, neighborhood informal usage, and sometimes a deliberate legal declaration. Perplexity also gave me important context about the specific world Salvatore was entering in 1912. The Italian immigrant community in New York was enormous by then, over 1 million people of Italian birth or parentage living in the city. But quote unquote Italian in that era covered a lot of ground, and people from Naples and Campania often had a very different experience than immigrants from northern Italy. Neapolitan immigrants tended to cluster in specific neighborhoods, take work in trades like construction and barbering and food vending, and navigate a social landscape where your Pisani, your people from the same hometown or region, were often your only reliable network in a completely foreign place. Understanding that context matters for genealogy research in a practical way. It tells you which neighborhoods to search. It tells you which churches kept records for which communities. And it tells you that the social pressure to blend in and be legible to American employers and landlords was real and constant. A name that Americans couldn't pronounce was a liability in ways that today are hard to fully appreciate. Perplexity also pointed me to something I hadn't fully appreciated. In New York during this period, a man could file a declaration of intent to become a citizen, sometimes called first papers, without ever completing the full naturalization process. These documents are held at NARA's Northeast Regional Facility, and many are now digitized on Ancestry and Family Search. And those first papers often captured a name at a specific moment in time. If Salvatore had filed them under his Italian name, and then his naturalization petition was filed years later under Samuel Martin, that sequence of documents would show us exactly when the transition happened. It also flagged something I hadn't thought to look for. New York State had its own courts processing naturalization during this period, not just federal courts, and the records from those two systems are held in different places and indexed differently. If I had only searched one system, I might miss him entirely. This is the kind of procedural detail that no amount of searching Ancestry will tell you unless you already know to look for it. Perplexity surfaced it in about 40 seconds. This is the kind of grounding research that saves you hours of spinning your wheels. Now, I had a research map. I knew what records likely existed, where they probably were, and what they might tell us about the name change. And that changed everything about how I searched next. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because after gathering that historical context, I went to the databases and found something unexpected. There was a declaration of intent filed in 1914 for a Salvatore Maranzano of Brooklyn, listing his occupation as barber apprentice, his country of origin as Italy, birthplace listed only as Naples Province. That was our man. Almost certainly. The approximate birth year matched. The borough matched. But here's the problem. The handwriting on that document was, to put it gently, a challenge. Whoever typed this form did so on a typewriter that was clearly having a bad day. And then someone had made handwritten corrections in the margins and below several of the fields. The corrections were in a completely different hand. Cramped, slightly tilted, and written in a mix of Italian abbreviations and English. I could make out pieces of it, but not enough to feel confident about what has been changed and why. This is where Gemini and Google AI Studio came in. And if you haven't used Google AI Studio for handwriting transcription, I want to be the one who convinces you to try it today. Not tomorrow, today. AI Studio is free to access at aistudio.google.com. It is different from the regular Gemini chatbot, and the difference matters. In AI Studio, you are working directly with the most capable version of the Gemini model without the guardrails that the regular app adds. For handwriting transcription specifically, researchers have found that Gemini access through AI Studio now achieves what's being called expert human transcriptionist level accuracy. We're talking about a character error rate of under 2% on historical documents. That means for every 200 characters it reads, it makes fewer than two mistakes. That is genuinely remarkable, and it represents a real shift in what's possible for genealogists working with difficult handwritten records. To use it, go to aistudio.google.com, create a free Google account if you don't already have one, and look for the model selector at the top. You want Gemini 3 Pro. Upload your image as an image file, not a PDF, and that detail matters. Researchers have found the transcription is noticeably more accurate when you give it a clear image file rather than a scanned PDF. If your document is a PDF, take a screenshot of the relevant section and upload that screenshot instead. I took a screenshot of just the handwritten portion of the Declaration of Intent, just that section, not the whole document, just the part I couldn't read. And I brought it into AI Studio as an image file. Here's the prompt I use, and the framing matters as much as the question. Quote, this is a section of a handwritten correction made to a declaration of intent filed in New York City in 1914. The person who wrote these corrections appears to have been a court clerk or immigration official. Please transcribe everything handwritten in this image exactly as written, preserving original spelling, punctuation, and abbreviations. Use illegible in brackets for any words you cannot confidently read. Use question mark in brackets after any word you're uncertain about. After the transcription, please note, first, whether the corrections appear to add, replace, or clarify the original typewritten content, and second, whether any of the handwritten words appear to be Italian abbreviations or phrases, end quote. Now, why did I include that second part asking about Italian abbreviations? Because Italian officials processing immigration documents in this era often use standard Latin or Italian abbreviations for common phrases, and if Gemini could flag those, I could then look them up and understand what they actually meant. It's about giving the tool enough context to give me more useful output. The transcription that came back was almost complete. Gemini read words that I had completely failed to make out on my own. And it flagged two phrases as potentially Italian, one that appeared to be a contracted form of a common Italian word for formerly known as, and one that looked like a standard legal abbreviation. Okay, stick with me here because this is where the mystery deepens. According to Gemini's transcription, the handwritten corrections in the margins of Salvatore's Declaration of Intent included a note that appeared to reference an alternate name. The handwriting was a correction to the original name field. Someone, at some point after the document was first created, had written in what looked like a bracketed alternate name. That alternate name was not Samuel Martin. It was Salvatore Martino. So we potentially had three names now. Salvatore Maranzano on the ship manifest, Salvatore Martino as a handwritten correction on the Declaration of Intent, and Samuel Martin on the 1920 census. This is not a simple Americanization story. This is a layered identity shift, and each layer happened at a different moment and probably for a different reason. Before I went any further, I needed to stop and verify. I pulled up the original document image and I read every word I could make out myself, comparing it against Gemini's transcription character by character in the sections I could read. It matched in every verifiable spot. The sections I could not read on my own were the ones Gemini had flagged as potentially uncertain. That's the right behavior. That's what you want from a transcription tool. And this is exactly why our golden rule exists. AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. Gemini gave me a draft. It gave me a starting point. I had to verify against the actual document before I trusted it enough to build on. Now, the question was what Martino meant in the context of this case. Was it a middle name? A family name that had been dropped? An earlier Americanization attempt? Or was it something else entirely? Was Maranzano a name that carried baggage? Could there have been a reason to distance himself from it? I want to be careful here and not sensationalize this. The truth is that Maranzano was not an uncommon surname in the Naples region, and many Italian immigrants changed their surnames to simpler forms for reasons that had nothing to do with anything sinister. Maranzano to Martino to Martin is actually a logical phonetic progression. You're keeping the Mar sound, reducing the syllables, moving towards something that English speakers could say without stumbling. But I still needed to understand the pattern, and that's where Claude came in. I brought Claude all three documents, or rather, I brought Claude the key information from all three documents, typed out as a summary, since I wasn't uploading actual images at this stage, and I asked it to do something specific. Quote, I'm researching an Italian immigrant named Salvatore Maranzano who arrived in New York from Naples Province in 1912. I have three records that appear to document a name change process over roughly 8 years. Record 1, 1912 ship manifest, name listed as Salvatore Maranzano, age 22, occupation laborer. Record 2, 1914 declaration of intent, name originally typed as Salvatore Maranzano, with a handwritten marginal correction appearing to reference the alternate name Salvatore Martino. Record 3, 1920 Federal Census listing Samuel Martin, approximate age 29, occupation barber, born Italy, wife Conchetta. Please analyze these three records and, first, create a timeline of the documented name evolution with your confidence level for each connection. Second, identify what records would logically exist between 1914 and 1920 that might document the intermediate steps. Third, flag any inconsistencies in the information that might suggest these are not all the same person, end quote. This is a prompt structure I want you to save. The three-part request, where you ask for a timeline, a research gap analysis, and a consistency check, is something that you can use for almost any identity question in genealogy. You're asking Claude to do three distinct analytical jobs at once. Build a picture, identify what's missing from the picture, and check the picture for cracks. Claude's response was thorough. It built out the timeline with confidence levels assigned to each connection. It noted that the connection between Maranzano and Martino was supported but not proven, and that the connection between Martino and Martin was plausible phonetically but would need documentary evidence. It identified the records that should exist in the gap. A barber's license. New York began requiring these in 1904. Any World War I draft registration under either name. A marriage record for Conchetta, and the eventual naturalization petition. The observation about the barber's license was one I wouldn't have thought of on my own. New York State began licensing barbers in 1904, and those license records, when they survive, can be found at the New York State Archives and sometimes through county clerk offices. A barber's license issued to any version of this name during the 1914 to 1920 period could confirm both his occupation and the name he was using professionally at the moment. It's a small record type, easy to overlook, and Claude identified it simply because I told it his occupation. That is the kind of lateral thinking that makes AI genuinely useful as a research assistant. It doesn't replace the genealogist's judgment. It expands the set of options on the table. And then Claude flagged something I had completely overlooked. The 1920 census listed Samuel Martin as age 29. If Salvatore Maranzano was born approximately 1890, he would have been approximately 30 in 1920. That's a 1-year discrepancy, which is within the normal margin of error for census records. People misremember their ages all the time. But Claude pointed out that if there had been a deliberate identity shift of the significance, age manipulation was sometimes part of that pattern too. It wasn't accusing anyone of anything. It was flagging a data point I should verify with additional records. That is exactly what a good research assistant does. So now I went back to the databases with fresh eyes and a much clearer research agenda. And I found the marriage record. Salvatore Martino and Conchetta De Luca married in Brooklyn in 1916 at a Catholic parish in the Bay Ridge neighborhood. The groom's name on the marriage record, Salvatore Martino, born Naples Province. The witnesses, two men with surnames that also appear in that Little Italy neighborhood where he had first settled. Now I have the middle piece. Maranzano arrived in 1912. By 1914, he was already using or experimenting with Martino, possibly because Maranzano was hard for Americans to say correctly. By 1916, he was marrying under Martino. And by the 1920 census, someone in the household, or the census enumerator, had recorded him as Samuel Martin. The evolution made sense. It wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a gradual, practical shift toward a name that let him live and work in America without constantly correcting people's pronunciation. But there was still one question I hadn't answered. Why Maranzano in the first place? Did he have living relatives in Italy still using that name? Were there Italian civil registration records that could anchor him to a specific town in Naples Province, not just the province generally? I went back to Perplexity with a more targeted question. Quote, I need to find Italian civil registration records for a person named Salvatore Maranzano, born approximately 1890 in Naples Province, Campania, Italy. Please research, first, which databases hold digitized Italian civil registration records from Campania from the 1880 to 1895 time period. Second, whether the surname Maranzano is associated with any specific community or towns within Naples Province that might help narrow my search. Third, what the Italian civil registration system recorded at birth in this era that might confirm family connections, end quote. Now, here's why this prompt works differently than just searching Ancestry. Perplexity can synthesize research across multiple sources and explain the structure of Italian record keeping systems in a way that pure database searching can't. It can tell you not just where records are, but how to use them. And for Italian research specifically, understanding the difference between civil registration and the commune level and Catholic parish records is genuinely critical. They overlap, but they're not the same, and they're held in different places. Perplexity confirmed that Antenati, which is the Italian State Archives free portal at antenati.cultura.gov.it, holds digitized civil registration records from much of Campania, including many comuni within Naples Province. Italian civil registration, meaning government-issued birth, marriage, and death records, began in southern Italy in 1809 under Napoleonic administration. So, for an ancestor born in 1890, those civil registration records almost certainly exist. The format is consistent. Birth records list the child's full name, the date and location of birth, the father's name and occupation, the mother's full maiden name, and the names of the witnesses present at the registration. They are extraordinary genealogical documents. The trick with Antenati is knowing which commune to search, because the records are organized by town, not by surname. Naples Province contains over 90 municipalities. Searching all of them for one surname is not practical. So the question Perplexity helped me answer was whether the surname Maranzano was associated with any specific area within that province. And it surfaced something interesting about the surname Maranzano. The name appears with some frequency in records from the area around Nola, a town about 25 kilometers east of Naples. Not conclusive, but a starting point. Armed with that, I searched Antenati for birth records from Nola in the 1888 to 1892 range and found 3 records for individuals with the surname Maranzano. One was a Salvatore, born 1890, son of Gennaro Maranzano and Maria Esposito. There he was, in the Italian birth record in his original language with his parents' names attached. That is the moment everything clicks into place. That is what genealogy research feels like when it actually works. Now, I had to connect the dots. I want to walk you through this piece carefully because this is the verification work that separates solid research from a story we're telling ourselves. The Italian birth record showed Salvatore Maranzano, born in Nola, son of Gennaro and Maria Esposito. The ship manifest showed Salvatore Maranzano, born approximately 1890, Naples Province. Nola is in Naples Province. Birth year matched. Surname matched. Common first name for the region and era. The maternal surname Esposito is extremely common in Naples, but the combination of all these matching details together was compelling. Patronymic of Gennaro was consistent with southern Italian naming traditions. This is strong circumstantial alignment. The Italian civil registration record also gave us something genealogically priceless: the mother's full maiden name, Maria Esposito. This matters because Italian records frequently allow you to trace maternal lines that simply disappear in American records. In American documents, Salvatore's mother barely exists as a data point. In the Italian birth record, she is fully named. That is a door that can be opened for future research, even if we don't walk through it today. But before I declared victory on the American side, I needed at least one more document connecting the man in America to that specific birth record. And here's where the naturalization petition finally surfaced. My listener searched NARA's online catalog with her new name variations and found a petition for naturalization filed in 1921 in Brooklyn under the name Samuel Martin, with a notation referencing a prior declaration of intent filed under the name Salvatore Martino. That cross reference in the naturalization file was the chain link. The legal record itself was acknowledging the name evolution. I brought all of this back to Claude for one final analytical pass. Quote, I have assembled the following documents for a genealogy case involving an Italian immigrant. A 1912 chip manifest for Salvatore Maranzano from Naples Province. A 1914 declaration of intent with a handwritten notation referencing the name Salvatore Martino. A 1916 Catholic marriage record for Salvatore Martino in Brooklyn. A 1920 federal census listing Samuel Martin in Brooklyn with the same wife. A 1921 naturalization petition for Samuel Martin referencing a prior declaration of intent under Salvatore Martino, and an Italian civil registration birth record from 1890 for Salvatore Maranzano of Nola, Naples Province. Please assess the strength of the evidence connecting all 6 records to the same individual. Use the categories proven, reasonably inferred, and requires additional verification. Then, identify what single additional record, if found, would most significantly strengthen the overall proof argument, end quote. This is what I call a proof assessment prompt. You're asking Claude to evaluate the strength of your evidence as a whole, not just as individual pieces. And this is genuinely intermediate level genealogy methodology. You're not just collecting documents, you're building a case. Claude assessed the connection between the ship manifest and the birth record as reasonably inferred, noting that the alignment of surname, given name, approximate birth year, and geographic origin was strong but not yet documented as a direct link in any American record. The connection between all of the American records, from the Declaration of Intent through the Naturalization Petition, was assessed as proven given the explicit cross references. And the full chain, birth in Nola through arrival to naturalization as Samuel Martin, was assessed as reasonably inferred overall approaching proven. The single additional record Claude recommended as highest priority, the ship manifest from the Italian side. The passenger list was created in Italy before the ship departed. It would have listed the passenger-specific town of birth, not just the province. If it listed Nola, the connection to the Italian birth record would become proven rather than inferred. My listener went and found that Italian side passenger list. It's available through the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation's database. And there, next to Salvatore Maranzano's name on the 1912 manifest, in the column asking for the town from which the immigrant was departing, Nola. That was the moment. That single column on a ship manifest connecting the name on an American census to a commune in Italy sealed a case that had been sitting open for 3 years. Salvatore Maranzano of Nola, son of Gennaro and Maria Esposito, arrived in New York in 1912, filed his first naturalization papers in 1914, already beginning to use the name Martino, married Conchetta de Luca in 1916, and by 1920 was known to his neighbors and his government as Samuel Martin. He became a barber. He built a life in Brooklyn. He became someone's grandfather. And for 3 years, his granddaughter had been searching for him under the wrong name. That is what this kind of research feels like. That is why we do this. All right, here's your homework this week. Find one ancestor in your tree who appears under different name spellings across different records. They do not have to be Italian, could be any immigrant, could even be an American-born ancestor where spelling varied. Open Perplexity and ask it to research why names varied for people of that ethnic background in that time period. Then open Claude and ask it to assess how confident we can be that the multiple records refer to the same person. Just those 2 steps, see what it shows you. And I want to hear about it. If you find something surprising, post it in our Facebook group, Ancestors and Algorithms AI for Genealogy. Or email me directly at ancestorsandai@gmail.com. I read every single message, and some of the best episode ideas come from exactly these moments when a listener tries something from the podcast and ends up somewhere unexpected. A quick note for those of you who want to go deeper with the Italian research techniques we touched on today. I've put together a companion guide for this episode that includes 10 additional advanced prompts, detailed workflows for working with Italian civil registration records through Antonati, strategies for building proof arguments across multi-document cases, and a step-by-step guide to the Italian side passenger list search that cracked this case open. It covers territory we didn't have time to get into in this episode itself, and I think you'll find it genuinely useful if Italian genealogy is a focus for you. I'll provide more information next week on where you can find that and how to get it. But everything in today's episode stands completely on its own, and you have plenty to work with right now. Next week, we're taking our research skills into a completely different kind of paper, newspapers. I have a case study lined up that involves a document I genuinely could not interpret on my own until I brought AI into the process. You are not going to want to miss this. Thank you so much for listening to Ancestors and Algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other family historians find us, and it genuinely means the world. Don't forget to join our free Facebook group, Ancestors and Algorithms AI for Genealogy, where I'll be posting follow-up tips and prompts from today's episode throughout the week. I'm also relaunching and revamping my website, AncestorsandAI.com, next week. Stay tuned. This will be your one-stop hub. I'm your host, Brian, and I will see you next week for another journey into the past powered by the future. Until then, happy researching.